In the video part 1, we saw how my great-great-great-grandparents had moved to West Bromwich and had converted to Mormonism in around 1840, and how in 1860 they began their long journey to Salt Lake City on the other side of the world. The family travelling party consisted of William and Bessie Walker, their daughters Jane, Lizzie and Sarah, their son-in-law Charles Webb, and their 2 grandchildren Emma and Charles Maroney. In this video I'm going to chart their journey across the Atlantic and across America. In their party of around 600 fellow Mormons, there were some who kept diaries, and I will use what they wrote to try and give an albeit indirect account of the journey that the Walkers and Webbs undertook. They left Liverpool from the Waterloo dock, once famous as a setting off point for emigrants, now an historical relic and converted into an upmarket housing development, with the old warehouses converted into apartments. The ship that the Walkers sailed on was called the Underwriter. It was an American ship registered in New York. We can see the names of the Walkers in the pages of the passenger records. The fare for each adult was £4, which for William, Bessie, Lizzie and Sarah amounted to £16 in total. The average wage for industrial labourers in 1860 was no more than £1 per week, which meant that the fare for the 4 of them amounted to the equivalent of 4 months' wages. The Mormons had a contingency fund to help the poorer families who were given loans to help with costs. I've no idea whether the Walkers had been planning this journey and had been saving for many years, or whether they took advantage of the loan system. Same with the Webbs, although the children and their mother had to pay only £7 10 shillings, making the total for the Webbs at £11.5. Sailing ships may look romantic, but they were cumbersome, they were difficult to manage and they were slow. They needed to be towed well away from port out to sea just to be able to catch the wind, and even there they were subject to the vagaries of the weather and the prevailing winds. One of the diarists was George Wright. He was obviously the proud owner of a pocket watch, and he timed every move the ship made to the hour. and so into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. But not everyone was happy with the festivities going on below deck. Among the Mormon passengers was a group of Swiss converts who had very different ideas on how Mormons should conduct themselves. And a storm there was. And so life aboard went on, with the group organising activities to keep their spirits up. And there was cooking to do, and cleaning, and tending to those who were ill or seasick. The days rolled by. There were also moments of tragedy. Two days later, on the 18th of April, a Swiss woman aged 55 also died and was thrown overboard. And the following day, on the 19th of April, a man aged 84 suffered the same fate. It must have been a great feeling to get off the ship and to feel the ground beneath their feet. Although this was a foreign land, here they spoke the same language, and, most importantly, there were Mormon guides waiting to take them through the necessary immigration procedures. The whole journey was a masterpiece of planning, and whatever you might think of Brigham Young, you could not fault his organizational skills. The first thing they had to do was to pass through the Immigration Control Center at Castle Garden, which is the round building you can see at the bottom of Manhattan Island. This picture was drawn in the 1880s, you can see the Brooklyn Bridge, which had just been built. But this New York was more or less the New York that the walkers found. Castle Garden was a large, chaotic building, rather like a cattle market, where immigrants were recorded and given a quick medical check. The group had to spend the night on the floor of Castle Garden, and then the following evening they boarded a nearby river steamer to take them upriver to Albany. Here I need to do a bit of explaining, because the official route, as shown on this map, is not the route that the walkers went on. Officially, there were two main routes for Mormons arriving from Europe. The first was to arrive in Boston and take the Boston-Chicago train, passing through Canada, Ontario, and then passing through Michigan. The second route was to arrive in New York and passing by boat along Lake Erie. For some reason, Walker's group arrived in New York and then went by boat to Albany to meet the Boston-Chicago train. Why? Probably because of contract obligations. There were thousands and thousands of Mormons traveling in the United States from east to west in those times. So for sure the Mormon authorities had arrangements with the railroad companies to achieve cheap fares. This was probably part of such an arrangement. The suspension bridge, which connected the USA and Canada at Niagara, was a wonder of the age. It was the first suspension bridge to carry trains in the world. And strangely, for some reason, you had trains on the top deck and road transport on the bottom deck. But tragedy was never far away. Finally, they reached Chicago. From here they would have to change trains and catch a train that would take them to the railway station that was the farthest west, and that was at St. Joseph on the river Missouri. From Chicago took them to Quincy on the Mississippi River, where they had to catch a ferry to cross the Mississippi, and then they got a train on the brand new line that was from Hannibal to St. Joseph. In St. Joseph they boarded a river paddle boat which would take them 100 miles up the Missouri River to Florence in Omaha in Nebraska. The 100-mile journey would take them around 2 days, calculating that in those days paddle steamers travelled downstream at 5 miles an hour and upstream at 2 miles an hour, which is more or less walking pace. Florence was the starting point for the wagon trains taking Mormons west to Salt Lake City. It was set up as a temporary post in the 1840s, but by 1860 it had become a sort of semi-permanent town. Here the travellers would be organised and allotted to the various trains. For some reason, Lizzie was separated from the others and travelled in a different train some weeks before. The others were assigned to a handcart train captained by Daniel Robinson. Although Charles Webb being the chaplain to the company, they were allotted a wagon drawn by oxen. Also in the Daniel Robinson company there was a scout called Benjamin Chadwick, who was later to become the husband of Sarah Walker. It was a hard way to travel, similar to pushing or pulling a large heavy wheelbarrow for well over 1,000 miles. The route itself, called the Mormon Trail, was more or less the old Oregon Trail with a few slight deviations. And by 1860 it had become a well-worn path.
He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Grace and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Forever.
But for me, the best account was by the company captain, Daniel Robinson, who tragically was to lose 3 of his children on his journey from home to Salt Lake City. Isabella Armstrong also relates an incident which shows the sense of solidarity and community spirit of the travellers. Their great journey from the industrial hell of Greets Green in West Bromwich to the relative paradise of the Salt Lake Valley. And there my story ends. Ruth Smith was kind enough to send me some material which has enabled me to put together a little cameo of what happened to the Walkers when they arrived in Utah. This material consisted of various obituaries and a really excellent family history of the Chadwick family. Let's begin with Lizzie. Lizzie Walker married John James in the early 1860s in Salt Lake City, but she was then killed in an accident, a travelling accident apparently, travelling with her husband John James to a Christmas event in 1867. She was travelling in a wagon which overturned when they were crossing a creek, and they both died. Bessie Walker died in 1872 and was buried in the cemetery at Plain City at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Her husband William, or Bill as he was probably called, died 10 years later in 1882, and although he had no headstone, I've been led to believe that he was buried alongside Bessie. As for the Webbs, well, Charles Pinder Webb died in 1890, and his obituary in the local paper was very revealing. It says that Charles Webb of Slaterville was a prominent member of the Liberal Party. Now this is very strange because the Liberal Party was the antithesis of the Mormon movement. Clearly, Charles Webb was no longer a Mormon, which is very strange because this is the man who was the chaplain of the famous 9th Handcart Company that crossed the Great Plains to Salt Lake City. There's a very interesting story there somehow. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I'd love to know. Here is a later photograph of the Webb family, taken around the turn of the century, posted on Ancestry.com by Kay Stevens, and I've posted it here without her permission. I hope she's okay with that. But as you can see in the photograph, you have on the extreme left Charles Maroney Webb, who was the baby who was carried in arms across the ocean and across a continent. And above him, second from the left in the second row, is his sister, Emily or Emila, who was also taken to Salt Lake City from West Bromwich. And below them, next to Charles Maroney, you can see his mother, my great-grand aunt, Jane Walker, Jane Webb. Jane Webb's obituary states that her funeral was celebrated at the Congregational Church, which confirms the idea that the Webb family were no longer Mormons. Sarah went on to marry Ben Chadwick. Now, Ben was the pilot in the same handcart company that Sarah and the Walkers travelled in, and Ben was the classic pioneer of the West. He was a gold miner, a farmer, an Indian fighter, and an all-round man of action. This photograph was taken around the turn of the century, and it's the only one I've got of the early Walkers where someone is actually smiling. And I think this indicates that Ben and Sarah had a very happy marriage. They had 10 children, although Sarah had 15 pregnancies, which was not unusual at that time. Sarah died in 1930, which was the same year as the death of her nephew, Joe Walker, who was my great-grandfather. But one question for me still remains, and that is, did they ever meet up again with the man who baptized them and really was responsible for them being in Utah in the first place, Lorenzo Snow? Now, they all lived in or around Weber County, and Lorenzo Snow, who was now a very important man in the Mormon movement, was also the political representative of Weber County in the Utah state legislature. So, did they meet him? He must have been living very near. If they did he recognize them? How did they get on? And so on. I'd be very interested to know. Knowing that Charles Webb later became an antagonist of the Mormons in Utah, the story must have been really quite interesting. In my next video, part 3 of the Walkers, I'll be looking at what happened to the ones who were left behind in England. That's Mary Ann, Absalom and William, and in particular my great-great-grandfather Absalom.